You'll lose everything you own if you don't pay us by Friday. The woman on my porch waved a fake invoice demanding $4,200 for HOA dues I'd never heard of. I wasn't part of any homeowners association. My house had been in my family since 1978, decades before this so-called organization even claimed to exist. At first, I thought it was just a mix-up, maybe someone knocking on the wrong door. I had no idea I was about to uncover the most elaborate fraud scheme our county had ever seen. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It was a Tuesday morning in late September, the kind where the air smells like coffee and cut grass and nothing bad is supposed to happen. I was in my kitchen editing photos from a wedding I'd shot over the weekend when I heard the car pull up. Not the usual mail truck rumble or the neighbor's Subaru. This was something heavier, deliberate. I glanced out the window and saw a black sedan idling in front of my house, engine still running like whoever was inside hadn't committed to being here yet. Then 3 people got out. The woman led the way, mid-50s maybe, wearing a blazer that looked too formal for a neighborhood visit and carrying a clipboard like a weapon. Behind her were 2 men in cheap suits, the kind you see at used car lots or debt collection agencies. They didn't smile, they didn't wave, they just walked up my driveway with the kind of purpose that makes your stomach tighten before you even know why. I opened the door before they could knock. The woman smiled, but it was all surface, nothing warm behind it. She introduced herself as Margot Hadley, president of the Oak Ridge Community Association, and said it like she expected me to recognize the title. She extended her hand, and I shook it out of reflex, even though every instinct told me not to. "Mr. Townsend," she said, her voice sharp and clipped, "you owe the association $4,200 in overdue fees, 18 months of unpaid dues, plus late penalties." She pulled a sheet of paper from her clipboard and held it out. The page was printed in full color, stamped with a gold logo that read, Oak Ridge Community Association. Below that were line items, monthly dues, late fees, administrative costs. It had the polish of something real, though every instinct told me it wasn't. I took the paper and scanned it, my brain trying to catch up. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice calm, "but I'm not part of any HOA. This house has been in my family since the 70s. There's never been an association." Margot's smile tightened. One of the men behind her shifted his weight, crossing his arms. "Mr. Townsend," she said, switching to a patronizing tone, "your property is part of our district. The deed may not show it, but the law changed. All homes in this area fall under our governance now." I looked at her, then at the paper, then back at her. None of this made sense. I'd inherited this house from my grandfather 3 years ago, and I'd gone through every document, every title record, every clause in the deed. There was no mention of an HOA, no covenants, no restrictions, nothing. "I have the deed," I said. "It doesn't mention any association." Margot waved a hand dismissively. "Old deeds don't supersede current regulations. If you'd like to dispute this, you're welcome to hire a lawyer, but I assure you, it will cost more than just paying what you owe." The smell of her perfume hit me then, too strong, almost chemical. It made my head hurt. I looked down at the invoice again. No office address, no phone number, just a P.O. box and an email that ended in Gmail. "This doesn't have your office listed," I said. Margot didn't flinch. "We're in the process of relocating. You can send payment to the address on file." I handed the paper back to her. "I'm not paying this. I'm not part of your association." Her smile vanished. The air between us went cold. She stepped closer, close enough that I could see the fine lines around her mouth, the way her jaw tightened. "Mr. Townsend," she said, her voice dropping, "if you don't pay within 10 days, we will place a lien on your property. That means you won't be able to sell, refinance, or borrow against this house until the debt is cleared. And if you continue to refuse, we will pursue legal action." She paused. "It's not a threat, Mr. Townsend. It's a promise." The 2 men behind her didn't say a word. They just stood there, staring at me like I was already guilty of something. Margot turned on her heel and walked back to the car, clipboard tucked under her arm, heels clicking against the concrete. The men followed. The sedan pulled away, slow and deliberate, like they wanted me to know they weren't in a hurry, like they'd be back. I stood there for a full minute after they left, the invoice still in my hand, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't quite name yet. Then I went back inside, closed the door, and leaned against the counter. I read the invoice again, slower this time, $4,200. 18 months. Oak Ridge Community Association. None of it added up. That chemical perfume smell still lingered in my nose, sharp and invasive, like it had followed me inside. I opened my laptop and typed the name into the search bar. Nothing. No website, no business listing, no county records. I tried variations of the name, searched for community associations in my area, and checked the state's corporate registry. Still nothing. Then I remembered something. I walked to my front door and checked the security camera I'd installed last year after a string of package thefts in the neighborhood. I rewound the footage 10 minutes ago and watched the whole encounter play out again on my phone. Margot's face clear as day, the clipboard, the two men, the black sedan, the license plate. I saved the file and backed it up to the cloud. I didn't know why yet, but something told me I'd need it. I walked outside to check my mailbox, and that's when I saw it. A plain white envelope, no return address, my name written in block letters with a black marker. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The message was typed, centered, all caps. They've done this to others. Don't trust them. I looked up and down the street, but there was no one. Just parked cars and quiet houses and the faint hum of a lawnmower 2 blocks over. I folded the note, slipped it back into the envelope, and took it inside. I stared at the 2 papers on the table, the fake invoice and the warning, when my phone buzzed. An email from Margot Hadley. The subject line read, "Final notice." I didn't open it. Not yet. I picked up my phone and called the county recorder's office instead. A woman answered on the 3rd ring, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could. She put me on hold and I listened to elevator music for 4 minutes. When she came back, her voice was apologetic but firm. "Sir, we don't have any record of an Oak Ridge Community Association filing with the county. If they're claiming to govern properties in your area, they would need to be registered with us. They're not." I thanked her and hung up. The quiet sunlight cut through the kitchen, and it hit me. This wasn't confusion or coincidence. It was deliberate. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some confused neighbor or outdated paperwork. This was something else, something deliberate. And I had 10 days to figure out what. The emails started the next morning. The first one arrived at 6:15 before I'd even finished my coffee. Subject line, "Overdue payment reminder." I opened it and found the same invoice, this time with a red banner across the top that read "Urgent Final Notice." The message was brief and threatening, written in the same clipped tone Margot had used on my porch. It ended with a line that made my jaw tighten. "Failure to remit payment will result in immediate legal action and placement of lien on property." The email was CC'd to an address I didn't recognize, concerned.neighbor.123@gmail.com. I stared at that address for a long time, wondering who was supposed to be the concerned neighbor and why they needed to be copied on this shakedown. By the end of the week, I'd received 7 more emails, all from Margot, all with the same tone, the same threats, the same mysterious CC. Then the phone calls started. The first one came at 11:30 at night, a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was Margot's voice, smooth and cold, reminding me that my payment was overdue and that the association had already begun preparing legal documents. She didn't say what kind of documents. She didn't have to. The calls kept coming, always late, always from different numbers. I stopped answering my phone after dark. I knew I needed help. I spent 2 days researching property law, reading statutes, trying to understand how HOAs worked and what authority they actually had. The more I read, the clearer it became. If an HOA wasn't registered with the state, if it didn't have articles of incorporation or bylaws on file, it didn't exist, not legally. I found a lawyer named Quinn Merrick who specialized in property disputes. Her office was 20 minutes away, in a small building near the courthouse. I called and explained the situation, and she agreed to see me that afternoon. Quinn was younger than I expected, mid-30s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense way of speaking that put me at ease immediately. I showed her the invoice, the emails, and the anonymous note. She read through everything twice, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "Mr. Townsend," she said, "if they don't have registration paperwork, this isn't just a dispute. This could be fraud." She leaned back in her chair and tapped her pen against the desk. HOAs have to file with the state. They need articles of incorporation, bylaws, and a registered agent. If none of that exists, they have no legal standing to collect dues, let alone place a lien on your property. I felt a strange mix of relief and anger. Relief that I wasn't crazy, that my instincts had been right. Anger that someone had tried to intimidate me into paying money I didn't owe. "So what do I do?" I asked. Quinn didn't hesitate. "We gather evidence, we document everything. And if they try to sue you, we fight back." On the 8th day, Margot came back. This time she had more people with her, maybe 4 or 5, all wearing matching polo shirts with the Oak Ridge logo embroidered on the chest. They didn't come to my door. They went to my neighbors' doors. I watched from my window as Margot handed out flyers pointing back at my house, her face animated and indignant. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see the looks on my neighbors' faces. Confusion, concern, suspicion. After they left, I walked outside and picked up one of the flyers from the sidewalk. It had a photo of my house, circled in red, with the word delinquent printed in bold letters across the top. Below that was a paragraph explaining that I had refused to pay my share of community fees and that my actions were putting the neighborhood at risk. It was signed by Margot Hadley, President, Oak Ridge Community Association. I stood there in the middle of the street, staring at my own house in that red circle, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about my reputation, my home, my life. That evening, I saw one of my neighbors, an older woman named Winifred who lived 3 houses down, standing in her driveway. She looked at me, then quickly looked away. I walked over, and she hesitated before speaking. "They said you're not paying your dues," she said quietly, almost apologetically. "They said it affects all of us." I shook my head. "Miss Blackwell, I'm not part of any HOA. I never have been. That woman is lying." Winifred's face softened, and she glanced around like she was afraid someone might hear. "They did the same thing to me," she whispered. "Last year. I paid because I was scared. I didn't know what else to do." Something cold settled in my chest. "How much did you pay?" I asked. She looked down at her hands. $3,500. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, watching this 74-year-old woman who'd been bullied into handing over thousands of dollars to a scam artist, and I realized this was bigger than me. This was happening to other people, maybe a lot of other people. On the 10th day, I received the lawsuit. A sheriff's deputy knocked on my door at 9 in the morning and handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a civil complaint filed in county court. Margot Hadley, on behalf of the Oak Ridge Community Association, was suing me for $4,200 in unpaid dues, plus $1,500 in interest, plus $3,000 in legal fees. The document was professionally written, full of legal jargon and citations to statutes I'd never heard of. It looked legitimate. It looked terrifying. I called Quinn immediately. She told me to bring the papers to her office, and I drove there in a fog, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I arrived, she read through the complaint carefully, her expression growing darker with each page. "They're betting you won't fight this," she said. "They're betting you'll either pay up or ignore it and let them win by default." She looked up at me. "Most people can't afford to fight a lawsuit, even a fraudulent one. That's how scams like this work. They rely on fear and exhaustion." I took a breath. "I'm not most people," I said. "I want to fight this, not because of the money, because it's wrong." Quinn nodded slowly, and for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I saw something that looked like respect in someone's eyes. "All right," she said, "then let's build a case." We spent the next 3 days gathering evidence. I pulled the deed to my house, every page, every clause, and made copies. I requested transaction history from the county recorder's office, proving there had never been a lien filed against my property. Quinn contacted the State Corporate Commission and obtained a certification that no entity named Oak Ridge Community Association was registered to do business in our state. I went back through my security footage and compiled every interaction I'd had with Margot, every threatening email, every late-night phone call. I took screenshots, I saved voicemails. I printed everything and organized it into a binder that grew thicker by the day. Then, late one night, I received another email. It was CC'd from that same mysterious address, concerned.neighbor.123. But this time, the message wasn't from Margot. It was short, just one line. "I have proof. Meet me at the public library tomorrow at noon." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I didn't know who this person was or why they were reaching out now, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to ignore it. I replied with a single word, "Okay." Then I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the main road. Somewhere out there, Margot Hadley thought she'd won. She thought I'd fold, that I'd pay her fake dues and disappear like all the others probably had. But she was wrong. I wasn't folding. I was just getting started. The morning before the court hearing, I drove to the public library. It was one of those old brick buildings with high ceilings and rows of wooden tables where people sat reading newspapers or typing quietly on laptops. I arrived 10 minutes early and waited near the reference section, watching the front entrance. At exactly noon, a man in his early 40s walked in, looked around, and made eye contact with me. He was tall, wearing a faded jacket and glasses, and he carried a messenger bag slung over one shoulder. He walked over and sat down across from me without introducing himself. "You're the photographer," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. He glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then pulled a folder from his bag and slid it across the table. "My name's not important. What's important is what's in here." I opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, nearly identical to the ones I'd received. Same design, same tone, another copy of the same lie. But the name at the top wasn't mine. It was his, and the amount was different. $6,000. "She did this to you too," I said. He nodded. "Last year. I paid because she threatened my family, said she'd report me to credit agencies, that she'd ruin me. I didn't know what else to do." He pulled out another sheet. It was a copy of an email Margot had sent to someone else, someone with a different name, demanding payment to something called Meadowbrook Community Association. Same logo, same structure, different names. "She's been doing this for years," he said. "Different names, different amounts, but always the same scam. I've been watching her. I know there are others." I looked at the documents, my hands shaking slightly. "Why didn't you go to the police?" He shook his head. "I tried. They said it was a civil matter, told me to get a lawyer. I couldn't afford one, so I paid her and tried to move on. But when I saw your name on that neighborhood app, I knew I had to say something." I thanked him, and he stood up to leave. Before he walked away, he turned back. "Be careful," he said. "She doesn't like being challenged." Then he was gone, disappearing into the stacks like he'd never been there at all. The court hearing was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Quinn and I arrived early and sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, reviewing our documents one last time. The building smelled like old wood and floor polish, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. At 1:55, Margot arrived with her lawyer, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he charged by the minute. His name was on the court filings, a partner at a mid-sized firm downtown. Margot didn't look at me. She walked past like I didn't exist, her heels clicking against the tile floor. We were called into the courtroom at 2:15. The judge was an older man, early 60s, with gray hair and a face that suggested he'd seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. His nameplate read Judge Sterling. He looked down at the case file, then up at both parties. "This is a collection matter," he said. "Plaintiff is seeking payment of Homeowner Association dues. Defendant disputes the claim. Let's hear the opening statements." Margot's lawyer stood first. He was polished, confident, the kind of attorney who could make a parking ticket sound like a federal crime. "Your Honor," he began, "my client represents a lawfully established homeowners association. The defendant has refused to pay mandatory dues for 18 months, despite repeated notices and opportunities to resolve this matter amicably. We are seeking the full amount owed, plus interest and legal fees, as outlined in the association's bylaws." He sat down, and I could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air, making the whole thing sound reasonable, inevitable. Then Quinn stood. She was calm, methodical, and she didn't waste time. "Your Honor, the plaintiff claims to represent a homeowners association, but we have found no evidence that this association legally exists. There is no registration with the State Corporate Commission. There is no filing with the County Recorder's Office. There are no articles of incorporation, no bylaws on public record, and no registered agent." She walked to the bench and handed the judge a stack of documents. "These are certifications from the state and county confirming that no entity named Oak Ridge Community Association is registered to conduct business or govern property in this jurisdiction." The judge took the documents and read through them slowly. The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Margot's lawyer shifted in his seat. Quinn continued. Furthermore, Your Honor, my client's deed, which dates back to 1978, contains no reference to any homeowners association. There are no covenants, no restrictions, no mention of mandatory dues. She pulled out a blown-up copy of the deed and placed it on an easel facing the judge. Every line, every clause, highlighted for clarity. The plaintiff has provided no documentation to support their claim of legal authority over my client's property. Judge Sterling looked up from the documents and fixed his gaze on Margot. Mrs. Hadley, he said, do you have articles of incorporation for this association? Margot hesitated. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered something to her, but she didn't answer right away. Finally, she spoke, her voice tight. Your Honor, the association was established many years ago. Some of the original paperwork may have been misplaced during office transitions. The judge's expression didn't change. Misplaced, he repeated. Do you have bylaws, operating agreements, any documentation that this association exists as a legal entity? Margot glanced at her lawyer and he stood. Your Honor, we request a 30-day continuance to locate and produce the necessary documents. Judge Sterling leaned back in his chair and looked at both lawyers. If you don't have proof that this association exists, counsel, then we have nothing to litigate. But I'll give you 30 days. If you can't produce legitimate registration and governing documents by then, I'll dismiss this case and consider sanctions. He banged his gavel once. Court is adjourned. We walked out into the hallway, and I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief, exactly. More like the first breath after being underwater too long. Quinn turned to me and allowed herself a small smile. That went well, she said. But this isn't over. They'll either come back with forged documents or they'll drop the case and disappear. I nodded, but I wasn't convinced it would be that simple. As we walked toward the exit, I saw an older woman standing near the far wall, half hidden behind a column. She was watching us, her face pale and uncertain. It was the neighbor who'd told me about paying Margot last year. She didn't approach, didn't say anything. She just stood there, and when our eyes met, I saw something I recognized. Fear, but also something else. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of it. That evening, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was distorted, digitized, like it was being run through some kind of filter. Stop, the voice said, or your family will be in trouble. Then the line went dead. I stood there in my kitchen, staring at the phone, my pulse hammering in my ears. I walked to the window and looked outside. Across the street, parked under a streetlight, was a black sedan, the same one from 10 days ago. I checked my security camera footage and rewound it to 11 o'clock the night before. There it was again, idling in front of my house for 3 minutes before driving away. I called the police and filed a report. The officer who came out was polite but skeptical. He took notes, told me to keep documenting everything, and said there wasn't much they could do without evidence of an actual crime. After he left, I sat down at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. I went back to that neighborhood app where I'd first started asking questions, and I typed out a new post. I didn't name Margot. I didn't name the association. I just described what had happened and asked if anyone else had experienced something similar. Then I hit the post and waited. Within 2 hours, I had 23 comments. People I'd never met, living streets away, all saying the same thing. They'd been contacted, they'd been threatened, some had paid, some were still being harassed, and every single one of them had been too scared or too ashamed to say anything. Until now. The comments kept coming. By morning, there were 47. People sharing stories, asking questions, tagging neighbors who'd had similar experiences. Some of the comments were angry, some were confused. A few were from people defending Margot, saying she was a respected member of the community and that this was all slander. But most were from victims, people who'd paid thousands of dollars because they were afraid, people who'd been threatened with liens and lawsuits and credit destruction, people who thought they were alone. One comment stood out. It was from someone who said Margot had used a different name for her fake association. Not Oak Ridge. Meadowbrook. The amounts were different too. $2,000, $5,000. It didn't matter. The pattern was the same. I screenshot every comment, saved every name, and started building a list. Then I noticed something. One of the commenters had tagged Margot directly, asking her to explain. Margot responded within minutes, her tone sharp and defensive. This is defamation. I will take legal action against anyone spreading false information about the association. But the more she protested, the more people spoke up. It was like watching a dam break. That evening, my doorbell rang. I checked the security camera first, half expecting to see Margot or her hired muscle. Instead, I saw a group of people standing on my porch. 8 of them, maybe 9, all neighbors I vaguely recognized but had never really spoken to. I opened the door and an older woman stepped forward. It was the same woman from the courthouse hallway. Her voice was quiet but steady. "We saw your post," she said. "We need to talk." I invited them in and they filled my living room, sitting on the couch, the chairs, and the floor. Some of them looked exhausted. Others looked angry. One man in his 50s introduced himself as a plumber who lived 6 blocks away. He'd paid Margot $2,000 last year after she threatened to report him to code enforcement for violations that didn't exist. A woman in her 30s, a teacher, said she'd been billed $4,800 and told her credit score would be destroyed if she didn't pay. She'd been making payments for 6 months, draining her savings. The older woman, the one from the courthouse, finally spoke. Her name didn't matter. What mattered was her story. She'd paid $3,500 in cash because Margot had shown up with 2 men claiming the association could seize her home. For weeks afterward, she couldn't bring herself to open the door to anyone. As they talked, I took notes. Not just the amounts, but the dates, the names Margot had used, the tactics she'd employed. Every story was slightly different, but the structure was identical. Margot always came with paperwork that looked official. She always brought backup, people in suits or polo shirts who stood silently and made the whole thing feel legitimate. She always used the same language: legal authority, mandatory compliance, immediate consequences. And she always collected payments in ways that were hard to trace: cash, money orders, checks made out to associations that didn't exist. One of the men, someone who worked in tech, said he'd tried to verify the association online and found nothing. No website, no public records, no board members listed anywhere. "I should have known," he said, shaking his head, "but she was so convincing, and I was scared." I understood that fear. I'd felt it too, standing on my porch 10 days ago, watching Margot promise to take everything I owned. Someone suggested we go to the police, but the plumber shook his head. "I already tried. They said it was a civil matter, told me to sue her in small claims court." The teacher nodded. "Same. They won't do anything unless we have proof of criminal activity." That's when I remembered what Quinn had said. If this was happening to dozens of people, if Margot was collecting money under false pretenses, this wasn't just a civil dispute anymore. This was a fraud. Organized, systematic fraud. And that was a crime. I proposed an idea. We needed to document everything. Every victim, every payment, every interaction. We needed dates, amounts, copies of fake invoices, emails, text messages, anything that proved Margot had been running this operation for years. One of the women pulled out her phone and suggested we create a shared document, something we could all contribute to. Within an hour, we had a spreadsheet. Names down the left column, amounts paid, dates of contact, evidence collected. The plumber knew someone else who'd been targeted. The teacher had a friend in the next neighborhood who'd received a similar letter. We started reaching out, and the list grew. By the end of the week, we had 47 confirmed victims. The total amount Margot had collected was over $186,000. Some people had paid in full. Others were still making payments, handing over chunks of their income every month to a woman who had no legal right to any of it. We compiled everything into a single document, an 87-page file with witness statements, financial records, copies of fake invoices and bylaws, email threads, and a timeline that stretched back to 2019. Quinn reviewed the file and didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. "This isn't a property dispute," she said. "This is wire fraud, extortion, potentially racketeering if she's been doing this across state lines or using the mail system." She leaned forward. "You need to take this to the district attorney. This is beyond civil court now." We sent the file to 3 agencies. The district attorney's office, specifically the fraud unit, the state attorney general's consumer protection division, and the FBI's white-collar crime department because the total amount exceeded $100,000 and crossed into federal jurisdiction. I didn't know if anything would come of it. I didn't know if anyone would take us seriously. But 2 days later, I received an email from the DA's office. They'd opened an investigation. They wanted to speak with me and anyone else willing to provide testimony. and they asked us not to publicize the investigation, to avoid tipping off the suspect. I gathered the group in my living room one more time and shared the news. The older woman who'd paid in cash started crying, not from sadness but from relief. The plumber sat back in his chair and exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for a year. The teacher smiled for the first time since I'd met her. We weren't just victims anymore. We were witnesses, we were evidence. And for the first time since this nightmare started, we had the power to fight back. 3 days after we submitted the file, a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit called my phone. Her voice was calm and professional, the kind that had seen 1,000 fraud cases and knew exactly what questions to ask. She introduced herself and said she'd reviewed our documentation. She wanted to meet in person. I agreed, and the next morning I drove to the county sheriff's office and sat across from her in a small conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and stress. She spread out printed copies of our spreadsheet and started asking questions. How did I first encounter the suspect? What exactly had she said? Did I have recordings, video footage, written correspondence? I answered everything, and she took notes in a leather-bound notebook, her pen moving quickly across the page. Then she asked the question I'd been waiting for. Do you know where the money went? I told her what we'd found. Every check had been made out to Oak Ridge Community Association or one of the other fake names, but when we tried to trace the deposits, we hit dead ends. No business accounts, no registered entities, just personal accounts that we couldn't access without a subpoena. She nodded slowly. That's what we need to establish. Follow the money. If she's depositing association funds into personal accounts, that's embezzlement. If she's using those funds to purchase assets, that's money laundering. She closed her notebook and looked at me directly. We're going to need help from your group. We need bank statements, receipts, anything that shows where the money came from and where it went. Can you get that? That afternoon, I called the group and we split the tasks. The tech worker tracked check numbers. The teacher requested copies from her bank. Everyone else did the same. Within days, we had proof, dozens of payments to fake associations. The detective subpoenaed the banks and called back 2 weeks later. We have the records, she said. 3 accounts in her name, $214,000 deposited over 5 years. The investigation moved faster after that. The detective brought in a federal agent from the FBI's white-collar crime division, someone who specialized in financial fraud and racketeering. They cross-referenced the deposits with public records and found something that made the whole case explode. The suspect had purchased a second home in Lake Tahoe at 2021, $680,000. Cash, no mortgage, no loan, just a wire transfer from one of her personal accounts. The problem was her tax returns showed an annual income of $38,000 from consulting work. The math didn't add up, not even close. The agent dug deeper, subpoenaing tax and property records. He found 2 accomplices, the husband, signing as treasurer, and the sister, listed as secretary. They'd received transfers, $86,000 and $43,000, none reported or taxed, all laundered through paper-only associations. Then the agent found something else. A clerk at the county recorder's office, a young man in his late 20s, had been accepting payments from the suspect in exchange for creating fake filing receipts. $5,000 in cash, paid over the course of 2 years, to make it look like the associations were legitimately registered. The clerk had been arrested separately, and when faced with federal charges, he'd agreed to cooperate. He gave up everything. Names, dates, amounts, the entire structure of the scam. He even provided copies of the fake receipts he'd generated, complete with official-looking stamps and signatures. The detective called me again, this time with an edge of satisfaction in her voice. "We've got her," she said. This isn't just fraud anymore, this is racketeering. RICO charges, the FBI is taking the lead on this now and they're building a case for organized criminal activity." She paused. "There's something else. We found 18 more victims outside your group, people who never came forward, who paid and stayed quiet. The total count is now 65 victims. The total amount stolen is $329,000. I didn't know what to say. 65 people. Over $300,000. Years of fear and intimidation and theft, all orchestrated by one person who'd figured out how to weaponize people's trust in official-looking paperwork." The detective continued. "We're going to need your help one more time. The FBI wants detailed transaction records, visual documentation, anything that ties the suspect to specific victims. Can you put that together?" I told her I could. I'd been documenting everything since day one, photos, videos, timestamps, metadata. I'd built a database using the same skills I used to organize shoots for clients. Every file labeled, every piece of evidence cross-referenced. I spent the next 2 days working with the agent, turning my photo archives and spreadsheets into something that could be used in court. He was impressed by the level of detail, the way everything was time-stamped and verified. "You do this professionally?" he asked. I told him I was a photographer, that organizing visual information was part of the job. He smiled. "You're better at this than some of our analysts." The final report was over 200 pages. Transaction flowcharts, victim testimonies, photos of forged papers alongside genuine county records, a timeline proving she'd been at it for 6 years, moving from area to area under new names to stay invisible. The agent reviewed it twice, then forwarded it to the prosecutor's office. A week later, the detective called me one last time. "An arrest warrant has been issued," she said. "We're moving in tomorrow morning. Do you want to be there?" I thought about it for a long time. Part of me wanted to see it, to watch the moment when Margot finally faced consequences for what she'd done. But another part of me knew that being there wouldn't change anything. The law was going to handle this now. I'd done my part. "Yes," I said finally. "I'll be there." The detective called at 5:30 in the morning. "We're moving in 1 hour," she said. "If you're coming, be at the corner of Elm and Birch by 6:15. Don't be late." I got dressed in the dark, made coffee I didn't drink, and drove through empty streets to the meeting point. The detective was waiting in an unmarked sedan, and I climbed into the passenger seat without saying anything. She handed me a vest that read "Observer" in yellow letters and told me to stay in the car no matter what happened. "You're here as a witness," she said, "not a participant." We drove 2 blocks and parked in front of a house I'd never seen before, but I knew it was hers. The black sedan was in the driveway. Lights were off inside. It was 6:07 in the morning, and the street was quiet except for the low rumble of engines as 4 FBI vehicles and 2 sheriff's cars pulled up in formation. No sirens, no lights, just a coordinated arrival that felt both sudden and inevitable. Agents stepped out, wearing body armor and carrying folders that I knew contained the warrant. The lead agent knocked on the front door, 3 heavy strikes that echoed down the block. It took almost a minute before the door opened. She stood there in a bathrobe, her hair uncombed, her face pale and confused. For a second, she looked like anyone else woken up too early by unexpected visitors. Then she saw the badges, the uniforms, the weapons holstered but visible, and her expression changed. Not fear exactly. More like the sudden understanding that a game she thought she was winning had just ended. The lead agent identified himself and read her rights from a card he pulled from his pocket. The words were flat, procedural, stripped of drama. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." She tried to speak, but the agent raised her hand. "Mrs. Hadley, you're under arrest for wire fraud, extortion, money laundering, bribery, and racketeering under the RICO statute." He gestured to one of the other agents, who stepped forward with handcuffs. She turned around slowly, her hands behind her back, and I watched as the cuffs clicked into place. Her legs were shaking. I could see it from where I sat, 50 feet away behind tinted glass. One of her neighbors, an older man in a cardigan, stepped onto his porch and stared. Another neighbor, a woman holding a cup of coffee, froze mid-step on her driveway. No one said anything. They just watched as she was led to one of the vehicles and placed in the back seat. 2 other arrests were happening simultaneously. The detective told me her husband had been picked up at his office downtown, and her sister had been taken into custody at her apartment across town. All 3 were being transported to the federal courthouse for initial processing. The lead agent stayed behind to execute the search warrant, and I watched as boxes of documents, computers, and file cabinets were carried out of the house and loaded into a van. It took over an hour. By the time they were finished, the entire neighborhood was awake, and people were standing on their lawns, whispering to each other, trying to understand what they were seeing. The detective drove me back to my car and handed me a business card with the prosecutor's office number. "There will be an arraignment this afternoon," she said. "You don't need to be there, but you can if you want. It's a public record." I thanked her and drove home in a daze, my hands steady on the wheel but my mind somewhere else entirely. I kept replaying the moment she'd opened the door, the look on her face when she realized it was over. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel anything except a deep, hollow exhaustion. The arraignment was at 2 in the afternoon. I sat in the back of the courtroom with a few others from the group, including the older woman who'd been the first to speak up at my house. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, with fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired. She was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hands cuffed in front of her, flanked by two marshals. Her lawyer stood beside her, a different one this time, younger and less expensive looking. The prosecutor, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor, stood at the other table with a stack of folders that seemed to contain the entire case. The judge entered, and we all stood. She was older, late 50s maybe, with silver hair pulled back and an expression that suggested she'd seen every kind of criminal and wasn't impressed by any of them. The clerk read the charges aloud. 47 counts of fraud, 12 counts of extortion, 3 counts of money laundering, 1 count of bribery, 1 count of racketeering. The words filled the room, each one a separate crime, a separate victim, a separate lie that had been carefully constructed and maintained for years. The prosecutor spoke first. "Your Honor, the defendant has a history of similar activity in Oregon between 2015 and 2017. She fled that state before charges could be filed. She has significant assets, including property in Nevada, and poses a substantial flight risk. The government requests that bail be denied." The defense attorney tried to argue. He talked about family ties, community roots, her lack of a prior criminal record in this state. But the prosecutor cut through it with facts. Bank records showing $329,000 in stolen funds. Property purchases that couldn't be explained by legitimate income. A pattern of deception that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of victims. The judge listened, her face impassive, and when both sides had finished, she didn't hesitate. "The defendant is charged with serious financial crimes involving a large number of victims and a substantial amount of money. Given the evidence of prior similar conduct in another state and the clear flight risk, bail is denied. The defendant will remain in federal custody pending trial." She banged the gavel once, and it was over. 2 minutes of legal procedure that decided everything. She was led out of the courtroom, her head down, her lawyer whispering something I couldn't hear. The older woman beside me let out a long breath and reached for my hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was steady this time, not afraid, just certain. A week later, we were back in the same county courthouse where this had all started, but this time it was the civil case. The fake lawsuit she'd filed against me. Her lawyer had withdrawn, and no one appeared on her behalf. The judge reviewed the case file, then looked at me and Quinn sitting at the defendant's table. "Given the criminal proceedings currently underway," he said, "and the overwhelming evidence that the plaintiff's organization does not exist as a legal entity, this court finds in favor of the defendant. Case dismissed with prejudice." He paused, flipping through more documents. "Furthermore, this court orders the plaintiff to pay $50,000 in sanctions to the defendant for legal fees, court costs, and emotional distress caused by filing a fraudulent lawsuit." Then he did something I hadn't expected. He issued a formal order dissolving any entity claiming to operate under the name Oak Ridge Community Association. "Let the record show," he said, his voice carrying weight, "that no such organization has ever been legally established in this county. Any future attempts to collect funds under this name or any similar name will be considered fraud and referred to law enforcement immediately. This order will be published in the county newspaper and posted on the county website." He looked directly at me. "Mr. Townsend, you've done a service to this community. This court thanks you for your diligence and perseverance." I walked out of the courthouse with Quinn, and for the first time in 2 months, I felt like I could breathe. The group of victims was waiting outside, maybe 20 of them, standing on the courthouse steps. They didn't cheer or celebrate, they just stood there, and as I walked past, a few of them nodded. One older man reached out and shook my hand without saying a word. The older woman from my first meeting was crying quietly, and when I stopped to check on her, she smiled through the tears. "You gave me my dignity back," she said. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded and kept walking. The first Saturday after the trial, someone suggested we meet at the neighborhood park. Not for any formal reason, just to be together without the weight of depositions and court dates and evidence files. I arrived around noon and found maybe 30 people already there, sitting at picnic tables or standing near the playground, talking quietly. The older woman who'd first knocked on my door was setting out homemade cookies on a folding table. The plumber was grilling hot dogs on a portable grill he'd brought from home. Someone else had brought a cooler full of drinks. It felt less like a celebration and more like the kind of gathering neighbors have after a storm passes, when everyone comes out to check on each other and see what's still standing. The teacher who'd been making payments for 6 months walked over and stood beside me. "I got a letter from the restitution office yesterday," she said. "They're processing claims. I might actually get my money back." I nodded. The prosecutor had told us the same thing. All the seized assets, the bank accounts, the Lake Tahoe property, everything would be liquidated and distributed to the victims. It wouldn't be fast, and it wouldn't be complete, but it was something. More than most fraud victims ever got. A man I didn't recognize approached with his 2 kids, both under 10, and thanked me for what I'd done. I told him I hadn't done it alone, that everyone here had contributed something. But he shook his head. "You started it," he said. "You could have just paid her and moved on like the rest of us. But you didn't." I didn't know how to respond to that. The truth was, I hadn't felt brave. I'd felt angry and confused and trapped, and fighting back had been the only option that made sense. But I didn't say that. I just shook his hand and watched his kids run toward the swings. The afternoon passed slowly, in the best way possible. People told stories that weren't about fraud or fear anymore. They talked about their jobs, their families, the small frustrations of everyday life that felt manageable now. The tech worker who'd helped build the spreadsheet sat with the plumber and talked about fixing a leaky faucet. The older woman showed pictures of her grandchildren to anyone who'd look. It was ordinary. It was normal. And that felt like the biggest victory of all. I found myself sitting on a bench near the edge of the park, watching everyone, and thinking about the last 2 months. How it had started with a knock on my door and a fake invoice, and how it had spiraled into something that had consumed my entire life. I thought about the late-night phone calls, the threatening emails, the moment I'd stood in front of a judge and argued for my right to exist in my own home without being extorted. I thought about the spreadsheet we'd built, the 87-page document, the FBI agent who'd complimented my organizational skills. I thought about all of it, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not pride exactly, more like relief. The kind you feel when you realize you're stronger than you thought you were. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and looked out at the street. It was quiet, the way it had been before all of this started, but it felt different now. The black sedan was gone. The threatening letters had stopped. The fake invoices and fabricated bylaws and forged documents were all evidence in a federal case locked away in some courthouse archive. She was in a detention center 40 miles away, waiting for a trial that would probably end with her spending the next 8 to 10 years in federal prison. Her husband and sister were facing similar sentences. The clerk who'd taken bribes had already pleaded guilty and was looking at 18 months plus probation. I pulled out my phone and opened the news app. There was a short article about the case published that morning in the county paper. It didn't use her name, just referred to her as a local woman charged with orchestrating a multi-year fraud scheme targeting homeowners. The article mentioned the 65 victims, the $329,000, the fake homeowners associations. It mentioned the FBI investigation and the upcoming trial. It didn't mention me, and I was glad for that. I didn't want to be the face of this story. I just wanted it to be over. But it wasn't entirely over, not yet. A few days later, I received an email from the prosecutor's office with an update. She had accepted a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to all charges and agreeing to cooperate with the restitution process, she'd avoided a lengthy trial. The sentence was 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of probation. Full restitution to all victims, payments to be made from the liquidation of her assets. Her husband got 4 years, her sister got 3, the clerk got 18 months. The numbers were clean, final, impossible to appeal. I forwarded the email to the group, and the responses came in slowly over the next few hours. Most people just said thank you. A few said they were relieved. One person said they'd finally been able to sleep through the night without waking up in a panic. The older woman called me directly, her voice shaking. "I didn't think this day would come," she said. "I thought she'd get away with it. I thought people like her always do." I told her that sometimes they don't. Sometimes the system works. Sometimes justice isn't just an idea. It's something real and tangible that you can hold in your hands like a court order or a restitution check. That night, I stayed up late that night thinking about what came next. The legal battle was over, but the recovery wasn't. Some of the victims would get their money back. Others wouldn't, not completely. Some would move on quickly, folding this chapter into the background of their lives. Others would carry it longer, the way trauma lingers even after the danger has passed. I didn't know which kind of person I'd be. I didn't know if I'd wake up 6 months from now and still feel angry, or if this would fade into something I rarely thought about. But I knew one thing. I wasn't the same person who'd opened the door 2 months ago and found a woman with a clipboard standing on my porch. I'd learned something about myself, about what I was capable of when I was backed into a corner. I'd learned that standing up to people who abuse power isn't about being fearless. It's about being more afraid of what happens if you don't. 6 months after the sentencing, the County Board of Supervisors held a public meeting to discuss changes to HOA oversight. I was invited to attend, along with a few others from the group, as part of a civilian advisory panel. The meeting room was plain, fluorescent lit, with rows of chairs facing a long table where 5 elected officials sat reviewing documents. A county attorney stood at a podium and outlined the new regulations. Every homeowners association, legitimate or otherwise, would now be required to verify its registration annually with the county recorder's office. A public database would be created, accessible online, where residents could check the legal status of any association claiming authority over their property. Failure to register would result in automatic referral to the district attorney's office for investigation. The attorney turned to me and asked if I had any input. I stood and walked to the microphone they'd set up in the aisle. I wasn't used to public speaking, and my hands felt unsteady, but I kept my voice calm. The database is a good start, I said, but it needs to be user-friendly. Most people won't know what to look for or how to verify documentation. The system should flag discrepancies automatically and send alerts to homeowners if someone tries to register an association in their area without proper authorization. The board members nodded, took notes, and one of them thanked me for the suggestion. A week later, I received an email asking if I'd be willing to serve as a volunteer advisor to help design the database interface. I agreed. The work was technical, detail-oriented, exactly the kind of thing I was good at. I worked with a county IT team to create a search function that was simple enough for anyone to use. You'd enter your address, and the system would show you whether your property was subject to any HOA governance, who the registered officers were, when the association was established, and how to contact them. If no association appeared, the system would display a notice. No HOA registration found for this address. If you have been contacted by an organization claiming HOA authority, please report it to the County Consumer Protection Office. We built in safeguards, verification steps, cross-references with state records. It took 3 months to finish, but when it launched, the county supervisor held a press conference and called it a model for other jurisdictions to follow. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had changed in quieter ways. The group of victims, which had started as 8 people sitting in my living room, had grown into something more permanent. We called ourselves Oak Ridge Neighbors, not an HOA, but a voluntary community group. We met once a month, rotating houses, and talked about things that mattered to us. Street repairs that the county kept delaying, a proposal to add speed bumps near the elementary school, a fundraiser for a neighbor whose house had been damaged in a storm. There were no mandatory dues, no bylaws, no officers with inflated titles. Just people who'd been through something together and decided they wanted to stay connected. The older woman, who'd paid $3,500 in cash and spent a year afraid to leave her house, became the group's coordinator. Not president, not chairperson, just someone who sent out meeting reminders and kept track of who was bringing what to potlucks. She didn't get paid. She didn't want to. She said organizing the group gave her something she hadn't had in years, a sense of purpose that wasn't built on fear. I watched her at one of the meetings laughing with the plumber about a city council proposal to ban backyard chickens, and I realized that this was what real community looked like. Not rules and enforcement, but people choosing to show up for each other because they wanted to, not because they had to. One evening, I was cleaning out old files on my computer and came across the folder I'd created at the very beginning. Security camera footage from the morning she'd first knocked on my door. I opened the video and watched it again. There she was, walking up my driveway, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 men in cheap suits. Her voice, sharp and cold, telling me I owed money I didn't owe. Her threat, delivered with absolute certainty. It's not a threat, Mr. Townsend. It's a promise. I watched it all the way through, and when it ended, I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel anything except a strange kind of distance, like I was watching something that had happened to someone else a long time ago. I didn't delete the file. I saved it in an archive folder, labeled it, and backed it up one more time. Not because I thought I'd need it again, but because it was a reminder. A reminder that justice doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people decide they're not going to accept being victimized, and they do the work to prove it. It happens because someone keeps records, asks questions, and refuses to go away quietly. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the system actually works the way it's supposed to. The next Saturday morning, I walked onto my porch, the same place where it all began. The street was calm. Kids were riding bikes at the end of the block. Someone was mowing their lawn 2 houses down. A delivery truck rolled past, stopped at a neighbor's driveway, and dropped off a package. Ordinary, normal, safe. I could hear voices from the park, where a few families from the group were setting up for another weekend gathering. Someone called my name, asking if I was coming. I waved back and said I'd be there in a minute. I stood there for a moment, cup in hand, looking out at the neighborhood. No black sedans, no fake invoices, no women with clipboards making promises they couldn't keep. Just people living their lives, free from fear, connected by something real. And I thought, this is what we fought for. Not revenge, not recognition, just this. The quiet, unremarkable freedom to exist in our own homes without someone trying to take it away. I finished my coffee, set the cup down, and walked toward the park.
Thanks for watching QA Stories. Share this video with someone who loves a good plot twist. And don't forget to subscribe.